pray with me. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me. And may these words that you hear be captured by your soul, enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. I found myself sitting here this morning, wonder whether it was love or fear that made me decide to come this morning. And I don't say that lightly, because what I've come to know is that everything we do is either driven by love or fear. And if you think about that, you will know that that is true for you as well. We make choices out of love and we make choices out of fear. And I'm not sure which this is. I also have to confess that I have no printed sermon this morning, because I could not sit upright long enough yesterday to put the words to paper. So I hope this doesn't wander, but given how I'm feeling, I'm not absolutely sure I can promise that, but I will do my best. A couple of weeks ago, when I chose the title for today's message, When Fear Reigns, I had no idea, of course, what would unfold over the time from setting the title until this morning. And once again, I find myself amazed at how the Spirit works, that things have happened over this time away that spoke very clearly into the idea of the reign of fear. And my first 5 days away were in Victoria at Epiphany Explorations, and I was already ill by the time I got to the ferry terminal on this side of the strait, and knew I was in trouble because the conference is very, very taxing in terms of energy, and here I was ill. So I found myself dragging myself to lectures, trying to stay with it as long as I could, and then making my way back to the hotel. And I said to several people down there, I was so thankful that I had a room with a view of the Parliament buildings, because I spent a good part of the time counting the lights on the Parliament buildings. But one of the lectures I did get to in 2 parts was given by John Dominic Crossan. And for those of you who don't know Dom Crossan, he is a passionate New Testament scholar and has devoted most of his life, with the exception of the 19 years that he spent in a monastery, he has devoted the rest of his life to the search for the historical truths around the gospel stories. And I found myself really struck, an epiphany, I suppose, which is what's supposed to happen at that event, when he talked about the Roman Empire and the success in kind of empire terms that it experienced in lasting 2,000 years. And when he asked what it was that caused that success, realized that at the core of their empire was a belief in peace. And the way that they felt that you achieved that was through victory, violent victory. But that they created a relatively peaceful empire by coming to battle with, taking over, installing part of their force, and then surrounding their whole empire with the war forces that would keep the peace. but it was a victory. It was peace through the victory of violence. And that in itself doesn't mean very much until you look at what happened in the little tiny place around the Sea of Galilee in those years just after the beginning of the Common Era. And he talked about these two developments. One was the John and the mission of baptism, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago, that was kind of the starting place for Jesus in his own mission. But then Jesus took a different tact with what has become known as the mission of kingdom, the establishment of kingdom. And what struck me, and John Crossan didn't actually say this, but what struck me as I was laying ill in bed for a couple of days was all of a sudden I had an epiphany that what happened, what moved and what changed between John and Jesus was a profound, different understanding of God. Because in effect, John's mission was the same kind of mission as the Roman Empire. It was one of peace through victory. John was baptizing people, calling them to a new way of life, to wait for God to come and clean it up. That was the mission. But it was still about some force coming in and violently, if necessary, changing the face of the world. And Jesus didn't do that. It was all of a sudden this new way of looking at God. That God wasn't going to step in and clean things up. But Jesus' message was clear that God was already in our midst. The kingdom was already in our midst. And we were being called through justice and through compassion to bring peace to the world. We were no longer waiting for God to do it for us. We were no longer waiting for an empire or a political party to do it for us. Jesus was calling people to fix the world. And that was profound for me, because when I look back on the story of Jeremiah this morning, I realized that our whole religious tradition comes out of a God that comes and intervenes, and often violently, to bring about peace. And it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. And I think for the first time in history, in a profound way, this Jesus of Nazareth said, God doesn't work like that, folks. God isn't some being that steps in when we're finally good enough or finally bad enough, but instead, God is already in our midst and calling the best out of us to make a difference. As I thought about that, I then realized that it seems to me that the Christian church has kind of messed up, because for the nearly 2,000 years since, we went back to waiting for God to do something. Or worse, we used our own violent nature in the name of God to try and bring peace in this world. And I think we're at a place now where we're being called to look again at what was Jesus really saying in that message of justice. So in the gospel story this morning, I find it interesting that at the beginning, when Jesus first started to speak, the story says everybody was amazed and in awe. And it was like a light bulb went on. And then all of a sudden, when Jesus challenged them to be part of the process of bringing peace, they went into a rage. They were still waiting for the Messiah that was going to come with the sword, for the Messiah that was going to strike down these horrible Romans and strike down these horrible religious priests that were doing them wrong. And Jesus was calling them to embrace each other. They were overcome by fear. They were overcome by fear of the unknown in some ways. They were overcome by a fear that this wasn't going to work. And all it was going to do was cause a whole lot of trouble. And they didn't want any part of it. And it came out of a really strong belief that community was absolutely critical, and Jesus was not doing what he was supposed to be doing in the community. And so rather than risk love, they chose to remain in their fear and throw him off the cliff. Now, if you don't know what happens in the rest of that story, it gets a little bizarre, because apparently when they got to the edge of the cliff, Jesus just kind of disappeared, almost as if he put on an invisibility cloak, and they looked around and he was gone. And you can take that for whatever it might be. I went from Victoria on to Vancouver for 5 days of candidacy and admissions board meetings, and over those 5 days we interviewed 15 new ministry folks. A couple of things that were really interesting about that. One, for the first time in the 8 years I've been doing this, all but 2 of those ministry candidates were under the age of 40. That's a profound shift. Most of the people that we've been ordaining and commissioning over the last number of years have been over the age of 60. Doesn't give a very long tenure in ministry when you're starting at 60. So that was exciting, but more exciting was what I had the honor to witness in those interviews. With one exception, and of course there's always one exception, there's always one person that really shouldn't be going into ministry, and we told her that. But with one exception, the energy and the vitality and the integrity and the authenticity was overwhelming. I looked at these young people, and 3 of them were interviewed at the end of their education process and now heading into supervised ministry. 6 more were being interviewed, their final interviews before ordination and commissioning. And 6 more were just beginning the process. And both amongst those brand new, shiny, unfettered and unencumbered new candidates, in addition to the ones that were now entering into full-time ministry, there was this incredible energy. And what I recognized was that they are called into this work out of love and not out of fear. They are called into this work believing that the United Church is a place of hope in the world. And interestingly enough, 4 of the 6 new candidates were not raised in the United Church. They have come to the United Church in their young adulthood, drawn by the message and the messages that we are proclaiming, believing that the world still needs a spiritual life, and the United Church just might be the place for that to happen. And they're doing this knowing that there may not be paid positions for them by the time they're done. Because we are in really, really tough times. And they don't care. Because they believe that God will be revealed in some way, shape, or form in this church of ours. And this is where they want to be. And I felt for a moment sitting in those interviews that I was sitting in that synagogue in Nazareth with Jesus before us, saying, this is the work we need to be doing. And all of us need to be doing it together. And so the question becomes for us, how will our faith live itself out? Will we sit back and wait for God to intervene? Will we sit back and wait for someone else to lead us to the promised land? Or are we prepared to let go of our own fears and to live into the love and the compassion that Jesus is calling us to? For in that there is life, and in that I have immense hope. Because in that there is no place for fear to reign.